AMH, anti-Mullerian hormone. Something that seems to cause an awful lot of stress. I think partly because it's slightly prematurely, I think, often tied to worries about ovarian failure, early menopause, fertility running out is kind of the thing that I think people worry about if they see that their AMH level is lower than they would expect, or lower than the graph say it should be. I'd like to just explain what it is, why the IVF clinics are so used to checking it, and why they're so interested in it, and maybe just a little bit about, just a couple of little things about what you can do about it. Right, to start with, what is it? It's a hormone that corresponds very closely to the amount of little teeny tiny follicles you have at the beginning of each month that are sort of your primed and ready cohort, ready to grow on that month, any one of which could be the follicle that is picked to generate the egg. And what happens is all of those little follicles will grow on until about halfway through the follicular stage, so probably about day 6, day 7, something like that, and then one of those follicles kind of gets the nod and then will grow exponentially and mature and develop and ripen an egg and release an egg. And the others will all just die off. AMH has a big corresponding kind of relationship with the number of these little tiny follicles that you have. So if your AMH is really healthy, you may have, 10 little tiny follicles ready to grow up. If your AMH is really low, you might find you only have 1, maybe 2, 3 if you're lucky. Have a much smaller number of these little teeny tiny follicles ready to grow. But when you think of the process, you realise that actually the number that you have to start with isn't, for natural fertility, isn't that much of a concern. Because only one of those follicles would be the one that would be picked to grow on and develop an egg anyway. So whether you start with 10 or whether you start with 3, by the time you've kind of passed that point where one of them gets chosen, the rest of them are already gone. There is nothing that relates AMH to egg quality. So even if with a low AMH, as long as you are ovulating, there is so much you can do for your fertility in terms of nutrients and diet and acupuncture and all sorts of things you can do, castor oil packs, all sorts of things that will lift ovary health, that will make it more likely that you will get pregnant. But a low AMH doesn't have any implication at all on egg quality, and neither does a high AMH actually. It just means that there are more follicles to choose from. Why are the IVF clinics so interested in AMH? Why do I so often get someone come to me who has been for a kind of fertility check and been told their AMH is lower than it should be at their age, and then they are worrying about whether their fertility is running out? When an IVF cycle happens, they need ideally a really good number of follicles at the beginning of the month ready for them to pump the hormones in, and all of those follicles will grow on and all of them potentially could generate an egg. They don't, they kind of, with the artificial hormones, they block that process where one gets sort of picked and grown on. They will all grow on. So you can see that if you start with 10 follicles, the chances are that you might get 10 eggs. If you start with 1 or 2 follicles, you might only get 1 or 2 eggs, and it doesn't matter how much extra drugs they give you. The chances of you generating any more than that are very, very small. So they're very interested in it from that perspective, because potentially they will get a better harvest, if you like, from someone with a better AMH. So they're not, some clinics are really not keen on working with people with low AMH. That being said, there are other clinics who specialise in working with people with a lower AMH. They tend to run a slightly different drug regime. They may run a slightly lower stim regime because they don't need that level of stims because there's not that many eggs to grow or follicles to grow. They may do something called egg banking, where they kind of very gently stimulate one round, pluck out the eggs, next round pluck out the eggs, next round pluck out the eggs. When they've got a decent package of eggs, then they go through the rest of the IVF process. So that's one of the main reasons that IVF clinics are interested in AMH, is because it gives them an indicator of how well you are likely to respond to the IVF drugs and how easily you will be for them to manage. Conversely, I suppose if your AMH is really, really high, then you are likely to be in that kind of polycystic ovaries sort of range, where your ovaries have just ridiculously too many eggs, and that in itself actually can be slightly difficult for an IVF clinic to manage. It increases your chances of things like ovarian hyperstimulation, but we'll talk about that another time. Things you can do about AMH are, well, for a start, before I go there, actually, one of the things that can cause your AMH to be lower than you would expect at a particular age will be if you have been on the oral contraceptive pill for a long time. That tends to leave people with a kind of subdued AMH, and that sort of subdued AMH will stay at a lower level, 6 to 9 months or so at least, before it will kind of come back into what would be considered a more normal range. You can shorten that time, and you can sort of improve your AMH through diet, nutrition, lifestyle management, stress management, acupuncture, always acupuncture. So you can improve your AMH. AMH is not a sort of one-way street. It doesn't sort of go down and stay down. It is quite possible, and I see it all the time, where someone has a lower AMH and it will go up, just with the right kind of interventions. The other thing that is quite interesting with AMH is, from a research perspective, is low vitamin D levels seem to correlate quite strongly with lower AMH levels. So if you have a lower AMH level, it is definitely worth double checking where your vitamin D level is, and if your vitamin D level is anything other than really robustly healthy, get yourself some vitamin D supplements, get yourself out in some sunshine, and lift your vitamin D, because it will have a knock-on effect on your AMH.